When Jesus was about 5 years old, in a completely different part of the Roman Empire, the poet Ovid published his legendary work, Metamorphoses. Among its many mythological tales, Metamorphoses tells the story of Narcissus, the figure from whom we get the term narcissist. Narcissus is known for falling in love with his own reflection. One day, he catches sight of himself in a still pool of water and becomes so entranced by his own image that he can't look away. He's afraid even to disturb the surface of the water to get a drink, lest he lose sight of his own image. In the end, he dies of dehydration, inches from water, consumed by self-obsession. Now, closely tied to this myth, but a lot less known, is the story of Echo. Echo was once a lively, talkative nymph, but Zeus, taking advantage of her gift of gab, used her to engage Hera in a distracting conversation so that Zeus could do his philandering activities. Her endless chatter distracted Hera, but eventually Hera caught on, and she cursed Echo from that moment on because the wounds against Hera were wounds of words. She cursed Echo with words. Echo's punishment was that she could only repeat back the very last words she heard. Echo's punishment was she could only repeat back the very last words she heard. Echo's punishment was she could only repeat back the last words she heard. Ashamed and unable to communicate her desires and herself, she flees to the wilderness, living in a cave. And it is while she is living in the cave that she encounters Narcissus for the first time, who has not yet been captivated by his own image. Rather, he is out in the woods hunting with his friends, and he gets separated from them, and he cries out, "Help me!" And Echo responds, "Help me!" And he says, "Come find me!" And she says, "Come find me!" All of which only confused and disturbed Narcissus. And so, assuming that she was just another one of his many, many admirers, he dismisses her with disgust and flees. Now, many throughout history have interpreted this story as the myth of unrequited love. That Narcissus is absorbed in his own image and is incapable of loving anyone other than himself, and Echo longs to be loved, but she is stripped of her own voice and is unable to express her love. Narcissus dies staring at himself. Echo dies alone. But as I was reflecting on the myth, something deeper seemed to be at stake, something that I think speaks to our need to talk about Sabbath day. You see, the tragedy of the Echo story in Greek mythology is not just that she couldn't express her love to Narcissus. Her tragedy was that she had no voice other than his. True oppression, like that experienced by Israel in Egypt, true oppression is the loss of voice. Narcissus wasn't merely unable to communicate original thoughts, it was that she had no original thoughts left. There was nothing of her left to communicate. Her only words were his words, the words of a narcissist. Echo's curse was to become an echo in the fullest sense, to become someone with no voice of her own, The only ability she has is to repeat what others say. And as our feminist friends tell us, voice, distinct, unique voice that arises out of a distinct, unique sense of self is essential to human flourishing. Without the ability to name your desires, without the ability to name your needs, without the ability to tell your own story, you lose a sense of self. And without a sense of self, all that's left for you to do is mirror the noise of the dominant society around you. And while we rightly acknowledge that oppression like that Israel experienced under slavery, under Pharaoh, we rightly acknowledge that it inflicts physical wounds. We must also attend to the fact that it causes deep, deep soul wounds. To speak of the history of this country, what white Americans did to black Americans, enslaved folks, was not just physical torture. It was generation after generation of inflicting soul wounds on a community. And those don't just heal because you fought a war and said, "My bad." One of the deepest of these soul wounds is the loss of voice. Scholars who study trauma tell us that over time, people who experience oppression actually lose their sense of self. Stripped of their agency, that is, their ability to make their own decisions, stripped of their identity, that is, cut off from their story, from the people who help them make sense of their story, they begin to internalize the narcissist's voice. They begin to internalize the narcissist's opinions, only able to echo the last thing they heard from the dominant voice around them. The great black thinker at the turn of the 20th century, in the early 20th century, James Baldwin, reflected on this when he was thinking about his stepfather, who was a pastor. And he said, the biggest struggle that my stepfather ever had was that he believed everything white people said about him. And he was never able to break free from the voice of whiteness that told him who he was. The Exodus story echoes this theme of voicelessness. Even as God delivered Israel from Egypt, both Moses and the people, as they are leaving, even as they're leaving, they get to the Red Sea. They've seen signs and wonders and plagues fall on Egypt, and they get to the Red Sea and they're like, well, apparently water is too big for God. And when they look at the water, the only reflection they can see staring back at them is Pharaoh's. They struggle to believe that freedom was even possible despite all they'd seen. Pharaoh had convinced them that they were not worthy of freedom. They couldn't imagine life beyond the boundaries of Pharaoh's endless production and exploitation, because Pharaoh had told them their only value was in what they provided for him. And they internalized it. They came to believe the voice of their oppressor. Again and again, their words reflected Pharaoh's desires. At one point, they even say, it would have been better if we stayed in Egypt. It would have been better if we stayed in Egypt, where he was literally murdering our children. Their voices had been shaped by their trauma so thoroughly that they didn't even have a voice of their own anymore, except for that which was loyal to Pharaoh. Like the mythic echo, they could no longer speak with their own voice. They simply dominated the voice of the narcissist who dominated them. Now, you may be saying to yourself, dude, you keep mentioning Sabbath. What does this have to do with Sabbath? I mentioned a few weeks ago that the Ten Commandments, and the Sabbath commandment specifically, were not just moral rules. They weren't to be a good people, Israel, now you need to follow the Sabbath. And make sure you attend church on Sundays or Saturday. Because that's what good people do. That's not what the Ten Commandments are trying to do. They are not obsessed with making you moral people. Sorry to all the politicians who want them in school classrooms because they think it'll raise moral school children. That's not what the commandments are doing. The commandments were God's way of weaning Israel off of Pharaoh's voice so they could come to discover their own voice. Their God-given, unique dignity and story. This is why the Ten Commandments do not begin with, I, the Lord your God, would like to make you a moral people, so let me give you these principles. No, the Ten Commandments begin with an appeal to story. I, the Lord your God, brought you up out of Egypt. It is the story of my rescue, and the next piece of that rescue is to wean you off of Pharaoh and to get his voice out of your heart. So how does Sabbath help us do that? Here is my counterintuitive proposal. Sabbath's solution to voicelessness is silence. Stay with me here. I don't believe that the remedy to getting the narcissist, the abuser, the toxic person, or system's voice out of your head, I don't believe that the remedy is simply listening to someone else talk. My gosh, we live in a world where people don't stop talking. I woke up this morning, I probably had like 12 notifications on my phone before I woke up. I used to sleep with the notifications on. Can you imagine that? I was like, to be a good pastor, what happens if Matt has an emergency in the middle of the night? He tries to call me. And then at some point I was like, you know what? Matt can wait until 6 in the morning. Sorry, bruh. The remedy is not the dopamine hits from notifications. The remedy is not that one more voice is going to solve all of my problems. Nor is the remedy for me to simply start talking. Our speaking, at least especially at first, our speaking only echoes the dominant society around us. So us talking isn't solving the problem. Consider Echo again. Even before her curse, she was constantly talking. It was her constant chatter actually that made her vulnerable to manipulation. She never learned to discern or to direct her voice with wisdom. Silence teaches us to hear the voice of the one who made us and gives us our identity as a gift. And in doing so, it helps us rediscover our voice. In the silence of Sabbath, we set aside our obsessions that enslave us and the anxieties that consume us and the work that we think defines us, and we stop and we listen. And it teaches us to listen differently even when we enter back into the chatter. Do you ever think about, like you go to work somewhere, right? Churches are the worst at this. But you go to an organization, and you're applying for a job or whatever, you're trying to get hired, and they're like, we're like family here. All right. Now, if you don't have a voice of your own, if you don't have an internal voice that pushes back, you're going to be like, yeah, man, let's do this thing. I will be loyal to you. I will give my life and my time to you, and I will even sacrifice the most important things in my life for you because we're family. But when you have an internal voice that is distinct and God-given and is your own, you can say, that's interesting because you can't just fire family members. At the church that shall not be named, that was all the rhetoric. We're family here. We're family here. We're family here. Oh, interesting. But I didn't know it at the time. I didn't have a voice of my own. Do you ever have you ever seen that Office meme with Michael Scott? And he's got the long hair from when he was like really young, and it's like he's interviewing for a job. He's shaking the guy's hand, and the guy's saying, "We're family in this corporation." And then under Michael Scott, it's saying, "Here is me applying for 12 other families this week." Silence teaches us to hear the voice of the one who made us, not the deceptive, euphemistic language of the people around us, of the system that wants us to feel loyal to it, though it has no loyalty to us as humans. In the silence of Sabbath, we set aside the obsessions and the anxieties, and we listen to the God who gave us a voice that is unique and distinct. And if you're thinking, dude, this sounds like a waste of time, because I'm telling you, some of you, you're listening to me, you're like, yeah, like I get this. This is what I need. Some of you, you're like me. If I were listening to me say this, I'd be like, this is a waste of time. What is a day without talking? If that's your pushback, this doesn't seem helpful. I want you to hear the voice of Marva Dawn, who is a Presbyterian sort of mystic. She says this. She beat you to the criticism, by the way. She says this. You might be thinking that it doesn't do any good to set your worries aside for just a day. If we merely run away from them, they will be there to bother us the day after the Sabbath, right? How many practical people think that every time I talk about Sabbath? Yeah, thank you, Betsy. Betsy is the only person in here who's honest. Betsy, you have a voice of your own. Everybody else? She says, if we merely run away from the problem, it's just going to be there the day after the Sabbath. She says, I've discovered that the longer I enjoy Sabbaths, the very customs of that day give me not only refreshment, which makes the tension much less powerful in the days that follow, but also new perspectives, new priorities, and a new sense of God's presence, which all cause the tensions themselves to assume a less hostile shape during the week to come. It recalibrates your voice. The Sabbath is not running away from problems, but the opportunity to receive grace, to face them. This is what worries me about a society that can't slow down. And I'm saying that in a profession that is known for massive burnout. That when we can't slow down, the only thing we can do is echo the dominant voices around us. We cannot hear God's voice or receive our voice as a gift of God. And this isn't just individualism we're talking about here. Silence before the presence of God allowed, for example, Howard Thurman, who is a classic black church mystic, who was the mentor of Dr. King. It allowed Howard Thurman to think and engage Jim Crow segregation in a way that didn't destroy his soul. We know that segregation, especially in schools, created better outcomes for white students than black students. And Thurman realized that segregation was actually robbing black children of their voice before they even had it. And thus it was important for black communities to learn to practice what he called inner authority, to maintain their own voice and to hear God's voice amidst the oppressive Jim Crow chatter. His biographer points out that Thurman understood that, quote, consistent contact with the presence of God neutralizes the verbal and psychological attacks. Consistent contact with the presence of God neutralizes the voice of the narcissist, because you know that your identity is not determined by them. All the voices that told black children and poor children of their inherent lack of worth It told them that they needed a white voice or a rich voice to have a voice at all. And Sabbath silence told Howard Thurman that attentiveness to God recalibrates our voice so that it is a gift of God, not a mere echo of the dominant society. Sabbath is how we tune our hearts to God's voice. Sabbath is how we recover our God-given voice. It is a beautiful irony that all the way back in the Ten Commandments, the spiritual masters have consistently taught us this, that the way to find your voice is through silence. Our chatter enslaves us, and the chatter of others enslaves us. We need silence so that we do not become mere echoes.